I stood in the restaurant holding a small ring box and shaking hands. Zara, Hira, Layla. I asked you here because I believe in us, I said. Zara crossed her arms. Us? What us? Hira laughed softly. Layla avoided my eyes. I want to build the family business we dreamed about, I continued, and I want a real future together. Samir whispered from behind me, bro, breathe. I nodded and opened the box. I know my plan sounds crazy, I said, but I love you all in different ways and I thought we could choose honesty and commitment. Zara burst out laughing. You think we would marry a man who can't even secure investors? Hira added, this is cute, Armin, but also embarrassing. Layla finally spoke. I told you not to do this here. I felt my chest tighten. I believed we were partners, I said quietly. Zara waved her hand. Partners? You were useful, not equal. One investor leaned over and whispered, this is painful to watch. Another guest recorded on a phone. I wanted to disappear. Please, I said, just tell me the truth. Hira smirked. Fine. You are too emotional, too poor, and too hopeful. Layla looked guilty but stayed silent. Zara said loudly, this proposal is a joke. My hands trembled. I remembered my mother's voice from years ago saying, my son, loyalty is your greatest strength. I swallowed hard. Was any of it real? I asked. Zara replied, the business ideas were useful. Hira laughed again. And your devotion was convenient. Layla whispered, I'm sorry, but Zara cut her off. Don't apologize for honesty. Samir stepped forward. Enough, he said. You don't deserve this. I closed the ring box slowly. I guess I misunderstood everything, I said. Zara shrugged. Yes, you did. Hira added, take this as a life lesson. Layla still avoided my eyes. I felt heat rising in my face as people stared. I turned away from the table. Samir grabbed my shoulder. Let's go, he said softly. As we walked out, I heard laughter behind me. Outside, the air felt heavy. Talk to me, Samir said. I gave them years, I replied. I believed we were building something honest. Samir shook his head. They showed you who they are. Uncle Rashid was sitting near the street stall. What happened, Beta? He asked. I sat beside him. I was a fool, I said. He looked at me calmly. No, you were loyal. But loyalty without respect becomes pain. Samir added, you need distance from them. I nodded slowly. I remembered another moment with my mother. She had held my hand and said, never beg for love. The right people will stand beside you. Her words echoed loudly in my mind. I wiped my eyes. Why did I ignore the signs? I asked. Uncle Rashid replied, because your heart wanted to believe. Samir handed me water. What will you do now? He asked. I stared at the ring box. I thought this was the start of my future, I said. Uncle Rashid answered gently, sometimes endings protect you. I took a deep breath. I feel empty, I admitted. Samir said, you're not empty. You're free. I looked back at the restaurant one last time. I won't beg again, I whispered. Samir nodded. Uncle Rashid smiled softly. I placed the ring box in my pocket and said, from today I choose self-respect over blind loyalty. I walked forward, my heart broken but my mind finally awake. Before I reached the restaurant, I told Samir, tonight will change everything. He asked, are you sure they feel the same? I answered, they promised we were a team. He sighed. Just be ready for any answer. I laughed nervously. I trust them with my life. When I first sat at the table, Zara said, why are you smiling like that? I replied, because I secured a small investor. Hira leaned closer. Only small? She asked. I forced a grin. Every empire starts somewhere. Layla said softly, you always believe in big dreams. I answered, because we dream together. Zara rolled her eyes. Dreams don't pay bills. I said, hard work does, and we have worked together for years. I remembered nights when we planned business ideas over cheap tea. I had said, one day we will run a company built on trust. We laughed together and I thought it meant loyalty. Sitting there now, I realized their smiles were sharp and distant. Back then, I trusted every promise. I woke before sunrise telling myself, keep moving, don't think about them. Weeks had passed since the rejection and I forced my days into quiet routines. I brewed tea and whispered, today I rebuild. My phone buzzed. Samir texted, you okay? I replied, trying. A knock hit my door. I opened it and saw a small girl holding a worn backpack. She looked up and asked, are you Armin? I nodded slowly. She said, "Why do I have 3 moms?" My heart stopped. "What did you say?" I asked. She repeated, "Zara, Hira, and Layla. They are my moms, right?" I stepped back and said, "Come inside." She walked in carefully. "What's your name?" I asked. "Mina," she answered. I gave her water. "Who told you to come here?" I asked. She pulled out an old photo. I saw myself standing beside the 3 sisters years ago. My hand shook. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. She said, "They kept it in a box." I sat down and asked, "Why are you asking about 3 moms?" Mina shrugged. "People laugh at me. They say my story makes no sense." I felt confusion burning inside me. "How do you know me?" I asked. She said, "They used to argue about you." I swallowed hard. "What did they say?" Mina looked down. "They said you were important but dangerous to their plans." Samir called me then. I answered quietly, "You won't believe this." He asked, "What happened?" I said, "A little girl is here asking about the sisters." He paused. "Stay calm. Ask questions, not accusations." I nodded. "Okay," I whispered. I turned back to Mina. "Did they send you?" I asked. She shook her head. "I ran away because nobody tells me the truth." I felt a strange ache. "Do you know why they have secrets?" She said, "They always stopped talking when I entered the room." I asked gently, "Did they ever mention me directly?" She replied, "They said you trusted them too much." My chest tightened. I remembered my mother saying, "Trust is beautiful but dangerous." I asked Mina, "Do you have family besides them?" She said softly, "I only know them." I felt protective without understanding why. "You can rest here for now," I said. Samir arrived soon after. "Hey," I said as I opened the door, "this is Mina." I watched him kneel and say, "I'm Samir." She smiled shyly. I pulled him aside and whispered, "I feel like my past just walked into my house." He replied, "Listen first. Truth will come slowly." I returned to Mina and asked, "What else did you hear about me?" She hesitated. "They said you had a big idea that changed everything." My stomach twisted. "Did they ever say sorry?" I asked. She shook her head. "They looked scared when your name came up." I stared at the photo again. "Why come to me now?" I asked. Mina answered, "Because you looked kind in this picture." Her words broke something inside me. Samir whispered, "This is bigger than you think." I nodded slowly. I told Mina, "I don't know all the answers yet." She asked, "Will you help me find them?" I took a deep breath. "Yes," I said. Samir added, "But we will do it carefully." I looked at the photo one last time and said, "It's time I face whatever truth they tried to hide." Mina looked around my small living room and asked, "Were you happy with them before?" I answered, "I thought I was building a family." She said, "They never smile when they talk about the past." I replied, "Maybe they are hiding guilt." Samir said, "Ask her about dates and places." I nodded and asked, "Do you remember any fights about money or business?" Mina said, "They argued about contracts and someone named Victor." My pulse quickened. "Did they ever mention promises to me?" I asked. She said, "They said you believed in forever." I closed my eyes and said, "I did." Samir added, "Write everything down before memories fade." I grabbed a notebook. "Mina, tell me the last thing they argued about," I said. She replied, "They said the truth would destroy everything if you came back." I felt cold. "Did they say why?" She shook her head. I whispered, "Then I have to find out." Samir looked at me and asked, "Are you ready for whatever comes next?" I answered, "No, but I'm done running." I promised Mina I would uncover truths they buried. I told Samir, "I feel like every memory is lying to me." I sat with a notebook and said, "Let's start from the business deals." He replied, "I'll connect you with a lawyer I trust." My chest felt heavy, but I nodded and whispered, "I need facts, not feelings." Later that day I met Miss Sanaa in a small office. I said, "I think my ideas were used without permission." She looked at me calmly and asked, "Do you have old drafts or messages?" I handed her my files. "These were shared with the sisters years ago," I explained. She scanned them and said, "We need to compare timelines carefully." Samir added, "There was also a man named Victor Khan." Miss Sanaa raised an eyebrow. "Victor Khan is known for risky deals," she said. I felt anger rising. "They told me he was just a sponsor," I replied. She answered, "Sponsors rarely hide contracts." I called an old coworker and asked, "Did you ever hear my proposal mentioned by Victor's company?" He hesitated and said, I thought you were working with them directly. My heart pounded. No, I said, I was cut out. He whispered, then you need to look deeper. Your plan looked exactly like their launch. When I hung up, I told Samir, I feel sick. He replied, truth hurts but it gives power. Miss Sana added, let's gather proof before confronting anyone. I nodded slowly. I don't want revenge without clarity, I said. That evening Mina sat beside me and asked, why are you sad again? I showed her an old business sketch. She pointed and said, I saw this in Zara's office. My breath caught. Are you sure? I asked. She nodded. They argued about who deserved credit, she said softly. I remembered a night years ago when Hira told me, trust me, I'll present your idea to investors. I had smiled and said, we succeed together. Sitting there now, I felt foolish. I told Samir, I gave them everything. He replied, you gave love, they used strategy. Miss Sana called later and said, I found documents linking your early drafts to Victor's first contract. I felt my hands shake. So they knew. She answered, the signatures suggest shared access. I whispered, that means betrayal started long before the proposal. The next day I met Layla at a quiet cafe. I said, we need to talk honestly. She looked nervous and replied, I knew this day would come. I placed the documents on the table. Why was my work used without me? I asked. She looked away. I didn't control everything, she murmured. I leaned forward and said, did Zara and Hira plan this from the start? She hesitated. Things got complicated, she answered. I pressed harder. Complicated or calculated? She said, we thought you would slow us down. My voice cracked. So you cut me out? She whispered, I felt guilty every day. I asked, then why stay silent when they humiliated me? Tears formed in her eyes. I was afraid of losing everything, she admitted. I said quietly, you already lost my trust. She reached for my hand but I pulled back. When I left the cafe, Samir asked, did she confess? I replied, not fully but the cracks are showing. Miss Sana said over the phone, continue documenting every conversation. I agreed and said, I need the full picture before acting. That night Mina asked, are they bad people? I paused and answered, people make selfish choices. She said, they smile on TV but fight at home. I felt torn between anger and compassion. I don't want to become cruel, I whispered. Samir looked at me and said, you have two paths, revenge or growth. I replied, maybe truth is both. I stared at the evidence spread across my table and said, this was never just rejection. It was planned exploitation from the start. I called Miss Sana again and said, if I move forward legally, will the truth come out? She replied, yes, but you must be ready for emotional storms. I answered, I already live inside one. Samir said, then promise me you won't lose yourself chasing justice. I said, I promise to stay honest. Mina listened quietly and asked, will everything change after this? I looked at her and said, change already started the moment you knocked on my door. I closed my notebook and whispered, tomorrow I dig deeper, no fear, no illusions, only truth guiding my next step. I sat across from Samir and said, I have two choices now, expose them or walk away. He looked at me seriously and replied, which one lets you sleep at night? I stared at my coffee and answered, revenge feels loud but dignity feels quiet. My mind replayed their laughter and I whispered, I still feel humiliated. Samir leaned forward and said, then gather facts, not anger. I nodded slowly. Miss Sana is helping me collect legal proof, I told him. He replied, good. Let truth speak instead of rage. I took a deep breath and said, I don't want to become like them. Later I met Miss Sana and said, I want to move carefully. She opened a folder and replied, we have contracts, emails, and timelines. Everything must be handled legally. I asked, will exposing them destroy me too? She answered, only lies destroy people. Truth creates boundaries. That night Mina sat beside me and asked, why do adults hurt each other? I looked at her and said, because fear makes people selfish. She held my hand and said, you don't look angry anymore. I smiled weakly and replied, you remind me that innocence still exists. The next morning Samir called and said, have you seen the news? I opened my phone and saw headlines about Zara's company losing investors after Victor Khan withdrew support. I whispered, the power shift has started. Samir replied, karma works quietly. Hours later Hira messaged me, we need to talk. I hesitated but agreed to meet. When she arrived, she smiled and said, "I miss our old connection." I replied calmly, "Say what you came to say." She sighed dramatically and said, "We made mistakes, but we can fix things together." I looked directly at her and asked, "Are you apologizing or negotiating?" She laughed softly and said, "Why can't it be both?" My chest tightened. "You only reach out when your world is falling," I said. She leaned closer and whispered, "You always needed us." I shook my head. "No," I said firmly, "I needed honesty." She tried to touch my arm but I moved away. "Join us again," she said, "and we can rebuild everything." I replied, "You mean rebuild your reputation using my loyalty?" Her smile faded. She said quietly, "You're being cold." I answered, "I'm being awake." She sighed and said, "Without us you are nothing." I stood up and replied, "Without you I finally see myself clearly." Her expression hardened. "You will regret this," she warned. I walked away without looking back. I met Samir afterward and said, "She tried to pull me back into the same trap." He smiled proudly and replied, "And you walked away stronger." I nodded. For the first time I chose self-respect over emotional dependence. Miss Sana called later and said, "We are ready to present your original ideas legally." I asked, "What happens next?" She replied, "You can launch your own company using your rightful concepts." My heart raced. That means I finally control my future. That evening Mina sat beside me while I drafted my new business plan. She asked, "Is this your dream?" I smiled and said, "Yes, and this time nobody steals it." Samir joined us and said, "You're building something honest now." I replied, "I'm building something free." I stared at the final document and whispered, "I choose growth over revenge." Mina clapped and said, "That sounds like winning." Samir added, "This is your turning point." I signed the papers and said, "Today I start again on my own terms." The next morning I walked into a small office space I had rented quietly. I said to Samir, "This place feels empty but honest." He replied, "Every empire starts with one brave step." I placed my files on the desk and said, "This business will run on respect, transparency, and shared success." Mina looked around and said, "It feels safe here." I smiled and answered, "Because nobody is pretending anymore." Miss Sana arrived and handed me the final legal clearance. I signed it and whispered, "My independence begins today." I watched the news and whispered, "Karma finally knocked on their door." Samir sat beside me and said, "Victor Khan just abandoned their company after the financial scandal." I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I never wanted them destroyed, I admitted, but they chose their own path. Samir replied, "Zara's reputation is collapsing fast." I nodded slowly. "She built her empire on control," I said, "and now she has no allies." My phone buzzed with messages from old contacts saying investors were leaving her business. I sighed and whispered, "Power built on betrayal never lasts." Mina sat near me and asked softly, "Are they going to be okay?" I looked at her and answered, "They are facing consequences for their choices." She frowned and said, "Adults make mistakes that hurt children too." Her words hit me deeply and I felt my anger soften. Miss Sana called and said, "The court accepted our evidence about your stolen work." I took a deep breath and asked, "So the truth will be public now?" She replied, "Yes, but be ready for emotional reactions." I answered, "I'm ready to stand calmly." Later that day Zara arrived at my office unannounced. She looked tired and said, "I need to talk." I replied carefully, "Say what you came to say." She sat down and whispered, "I underestimated you and overestimated my control." I listened silently. She said, "Victor used us and left us when things fell apart." I replied, "You used me first." She lowered her eyes and said, "I regret humiliating you." I answered honestly, "Regret doesn't erase damage." She asked quietly, "Can you forgive me?" I said, "Forgiveness takes time and distance." After she left, Samir asked, "How do you feel?" I replied, "Not angry anymore, just tired." He smiled gently and said, "That means you're healing." I nodded slowly. That evening Hira called me. "I need your help," she said urgently. I answered, "Help with what?" She said, "Public opinion is destroying me." I replied calmly, "Truth is not destruction, lies are." She cried and said, "I manipulated you because I was afraid of being weak." I said softly, "Your fear caused real harm." She asked, "Do you hate me?" I answered, "I don't hate you, but I don't trust you anymore." The next day Layla met me quietly in a park. She said, I carry guilt every day. I replied, guilt means you understand what happened. She looked at Mina playing nearby and whispered, she deserves better than our mistakes. I asked, why didn't you protect me when they betrayed me? She said, I was scared and selfish. I sighed and said, we all made choices we must live with. Mina later asked me directly, what is my real connection to them? I took a deep breath and said, they shared responsibility for raising you after a broken agreement involving my old business. She looked confused. So I was part of their secret? I nodded sadly and said, yes, their decisions affected your life too. She hugged me and said, I'm glad you tell me the truth. Miss Sanaa held a press conference announcing the legal ruling that confirmed my work had been stolen. Reporters called me asking for comments. I said clearly, I want fairness, not revenge. Samir whispered, you sound stronger than ever. I replied, because I finally know my worth. Later that night I reflected aloud, I used to beg for approval. Samir said, now they come to you seeking forgiveness. I looked at my reflection and said, I'm no longer the broken man they rejected. Mina smiled and said, you look peaceful now. I answered, peace comes from truth. As I closed my office door, I whispered to myself, the power has shifted and I finally stand on my own. The following morning I received another message from Zara saying, thank you for listening yesterday. I replied, listening does not mean returning. Samir asked, do you feel closure? I answered, I feel distance and distance is healthy. Mina handed me a drawing showing 3 broken crowns and 1 growing tree. I asked, what does this mean? She said, the crowns fell because they were heavy, but the tree grows because it is free. I smiled and said, that is how I feel now. Miss Sanaa later told me, more people are supporting your honesty. I whispered, I only shared the truth. Samir laughed and said, truth is louder than revenge. And healing finally feels possible. I sat in the quiet cafe waiting, my hands folded over my notebook. Samir leaned across and whispered, they'll be here soon. Are you ready? I took a deep breath and said, I don't want anger today. I want clarity. He nodded. Then speak from truth, not pain. Zara arrived first, her eyes avoiding mine. I never realized how much I hurt you, she said softly. I replied calmly, I know you regret it. That's enough for today. She swallowed and added, I wish I had been honest. I nodded slowly. Honesty is a late gift, Zara. But I won't reopen wounds. She looked down and I felt no triumph, just relief. Hira came next, her expression tense. Armin. I manipulated you, she admitted. I kept my voice steady. You did. And I forgive your weakness, not your lies. She flinched slightly. I wanted to make amends, to fix things. I shook my head gently. The past is fixed, Hira. What matters is what I do with it now. She stared for a moment and whispered, I was selfish. I nodded, feeling compassion replace anger. Layla arrived last, her hands fidgeting. I'm sorry for staying silent, she said, voice trembling. I looked at her and said softly, I know, Layla. And I see that guilt weighs on you. She lowered her gaze. I wanted to protect you, but I was too afraid to act. I took a deep breath. Sometimes protection comes from letting go, not intervening. I hope you understand. After they left, I sat back and whispered to Samir, I feel lighter. He smiled and said, that's victory. Not revenge, but peace. I nodded. I finally see that proving myself to them was never the point. Mina walked up, holding a small notebook. Uncle Armin, can I live somewhere safe? She asked. I smiled and said, yes, Mina. We'll make sure your future is protected. She hugged me and I realized hope can bloom even after betrayal. Uncle Rashid joined us at the park bench. You handled them wisely, he said. I replied, it was hard but necessary. He leaned back and said, survival isn't about revenge. It's about growth. And today you've grown. I looked at the sky and whispered, I understand that now. Later, Samir asked, what will you do next? I answered, I'll continue building my life honestly without needing anyone's approval. He smiled. That's true independence. I nodded, thinking of all the nights I spent doubting myself. I used to seek validation from people who didn't care. Now, I only seek clarity and peace. Mina sat beside me, drawing quietly. Do you miss them? She asked. I thought carefully. Not in the way I used to, I said. I remember the lessons, not the pain. She looked up, curious. Are you happy? I smiled faintly. Yes, because I finally value myself enough not to beg for love or approval. That night, I locked my office and whispered, "This chapter is over. I am free." Samir said, "Freedom looks good on you." I laughed softly. "It feels even better." Mina's laughter echoed from the living room. I whispered, "Even in small joys there is justice." I remembered my mother's voice from years ago. "Stand strong, my son. Life will reward honesty and patience." I closed my eyes and nodded. "I finally understand, Mother. Karma, truth, and self-respect matter more than revenge." Before leaving the office, I wrote in my notebook, "I survived humiliation. I reclaimed myself. I am no longer defined by their actions, only by my choices." Samir read over my shoulder and said, "That's powerful." I replied, "It's not power. It's peace." Standing alone on the balcony, I looked at the city lights and whispered, "I am enough." The wind felt calm, carrying away the last traces of anger. I smiled faintly, thinking justice comes quietly, not with loud revenge, but with truth, self-respect, and the courage to move forward. Mina waved from the room, Samir leaned against the doorway, and I finally felt whole.
If this story stayed with you, subscribe now for the next powerful story.